This is Jeff Martin with Booksmart Tulsa and Magic City Books. We're thrilled to have you here back for our weekly virtual event series. We've been doing Monday and Thursday night book events virtually for I think the last 17 years now, it seems like. So here we are again. It's been great to have you guys all joining us. It's been a really cool opportunity for us to reach new people. I've seen a lot of people watching from all over the country. That's really kind of neat, following their favorite authors around and watching. So if you haven't seen one of our events before, you've never been to Tulsa, or you don't know about Magic City Books, thank you for watching. I hope you'll look us up and learn a little bit more about us. We have a lot of fun events coming up. Pretty much every Monday and Thursday for the next 2 or 3 months are almost solidly booked. Next week, we're going to be doing an event on the 14th with Tom Clavin, who's written this new book about Tombstone, the actual story behind the Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday mythos, and the movie, of course, everybody's seen. But that should be a really interesting deep dive into history. And then we have some great novelists coming up. We booked an event with the comedian Mike Birbiglia that's going to be doing a virtual event with us. John Waters is going to be doing an event with us virtually in August. So it's pretty all over the place. So we got from an evolutionary biologist to John Waters and everything in between. So should be a really fun next couple of months. So I encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and check that out. Couldn't be more thrilled to have Neal Shubin with us tonight. Neal has done a zillion things, so I won't go through the whole biography, but Neal is a evolutionary biologist, a paleontologist. You may have seen his fantastic, I believe it was 3-part series on Nova, Your Inner Fish, and probably read that book as well. Neal also teaches at the University of Chicago and is the provost for the wonderful Field Museum there. I'm not sure we even all know what a provost is. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but it's a fancy sounding word. So I think it must be very, very important, but it's a good one. But we're thrilled to have Neal with us to talk about Some Assembly Required, a book that really kind of blew my mind in the best possible way. So welcome, Neal. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
I kind of usually go kind of from the hip with these conversations, but there's so much meat in this book that I actually made a few notes to talk about. And one of the things I'm always impressed with science writing and nature writing, and this kind of straddles the line between a lot of those different disciplines, is the distillation, right? And I think something I've loved about your work up till now, and including this book, is, figuring out a way to make things make sense to people who have not spent their whole life deep diving into these topics. And not everybody can do that. And I think that's why certain writers who are also scientists themselves can do these two things. Is that something that you've kind of known how to do all along, or is that a learned process?
Well, thank you for saying that I can do it. First off, I mean, because that's essentially the piece that you really have to work hard at as a science writer for the general public. You want to do it in a way that respects the intelligence of your audience, but you have to. Science can be really complicated, and we scientists love the details, but you can't always get into the details because the details that we dwell in as scientists may not be as interesting to the general public. But yeah, for me, it really came about. My father was a mystery writer or a thriller writer, and who had a phobia of science. Yet he had a son who became a scientist. And so he always told me, he says, Neal, someday you should write a book. Well, here you are, Dad. I've written a book, written a couple of them, written 3 of them. But he's always been sort of my muse here because he always believed in the power of storytelling, and that even for science writing, that stories are important, and you need characters and a narrative arc, and you need something that's compelling at the human level. Yes, science has its intellectual joys, its joys of understanding the world, but fundamentally it's a human enterprise. And with people making mistakes or getting lucky or working hard or overcoming adversity, and those are the human elements that I think, if I can pin a scientific story around the human element, then I think I've done well, and to try to distill it in a way that I think that people can leave it with saying, oh, that's really interesting science. Yeah, that's cool. Maybe you want to explore it a little bit more, or just feel satisfied in knowing it. Yeah, so it's my dad. And so when when he was alive, he passed away recently. When he was alive, I used to give him my chapters as I wrote them, and if like Dad understood them, then I was okay. And if Dad thought it was a good story, then I did all
He
right.
was
So.
he was kind of the sounding board for your kind of layman audience.
Oh, most definitely, yeah, most definitely.
That's great. Um, the book, Some Assembly Required, I should say, we're going to be sharing links in the chat to purchase the book. If you don't have it yet, please do get that through us. That'd be great. And also, if you have questions, start putting those in here now into our Q&A function, and I'll try to work those in as we go. So there's a quick commercial there. The book has one of those great log lines, which is this idea of like, we're going to look at 4 billion years in a few hundred pages. That's a great kind of what I was talking about, distillation, and it piques people's interest. But we're talking about evolution here, and you're an evolutionary biologist and a paleontologist. I kind of all know generally what a paleontologist is because we've seen Jurassic Park and all these different things. But I'm curious to kind of hear from you what an evolutionary biologist is specifically, like what the discipline is that kind of puts you into that bucket.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, there's different ways of being an evolutionary biologist. The way that I am is I want to understand the history of our planet. I want to understand the history of life. Why does life look the way it does? Why does animal and plant diversity? Why is it shaped the way it is? And some people study the mechanisms of evolution, natural selection, and other things. I don't study that as much. I study the history piece because I've always loved history. If you trace different species back, how can we understand how fish evolved to walk on land, or birds evolved to fly? These great transitions. And so there are different tools to do that. So when you think about trying to understand the history of life, you can go out and find fossils, like my team does. Go out and find, fish with arms and legs, to try to understand the transition from life in water to life on land. But you can also understand you can also study other data. And that's one of the things I wanted to pull in the book a bit, which is DNA. We have this great revolution in molecular biology in the last last 5 decades, where we now have the sequence of different species, and we can compare the genome sequence of a salamander to the genome sequence of a fish to the genome sequence of a person, and ask what's similar and what's different, what genes make them unique, what genes do they share. And that's really powerful. So when you think about the kind of evolutionary biology I do that's historical, you can collect fossils, you can study genes and DNA, you can study embryos. There's different lines of data that you can pull into these things. And to me, honestly, that's what makes it so exciting and fun, right? I mean, it's never dull because I'm always learning something new. So I trained as a paleontologist. I trained to find fossils. But then somewhere along the way, early in my career, I realized, I needed to add more stuff to my toolkit. That's when I trained in molecular biology and DNA biology as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about, being a fossil hunter, your early, that's kind of like the sexy part. Like everybody kind of feels like, oh, you're out there digging up these fossils. I went to see a show at the Perot Museum of Science in Dallas recently called Origins. And it's a major fossil show of fossils that had been brought over for the first time, I think, ever outside. They came from South Africa, from a major find in South Africa. And I hadn't really seen a show of that scale of fossils in one place at any given time. And the time I spent in there kind of looking at these kind of reconstructed skeletal figures and stuff like that, for the first time in my life, felt connected to it. When I was a kid, I would see these things and they always kind of felt disconnected. It's like a bunch of bones and I couldn't put a narrative to it to make it seem like this had a human element to it. When did you kind of get the first buzz about, wanting to be interested in fossils and looking into those, digging around?
Yeah. So for me, it began in my student days. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. And so when I went to college, I knew I loved science, but I didn't know any evolutionary biology, paleontology. I was all just whatever. But I took a course on human evolution my first semester of college, just randomly. It was, I had the space in my calendar, my schedule is to it. And it was taught by a researcher at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, one of the great dinosaur museum, actually. And each week he would bring in fossils, casts or original fossils of, human relatives. and it just blew my mind. I mean, like, here's physical evidence of the history of life, and we can learn, about millions of years in the distant past from these fossils. And I was like, it blew me away that people could actually go out and figure out places to look, and then find, evidence that tells us about this great history of our species or other species and so forth. So I got the bug then, and then, and then I started to volunteer at the museum, and I got invited on a dig. My junior year of college was like everybody kid's dream. It was a dinosaur dig, even better. Like every kid's dream, like dig like Triceratops or whatever. And I was a total disaster. I really was. I was so inept at it entirely. So much so that the person who was running it was like, kid, stay in a museum. You're just breaking this stuff. But I really loved it. I really loved the fact that you can do field work and find
Where
fossils.
was that first dig?
That was in Wyoming, in southeastern Wyoming, right on the border with South Dakota. And it was in Cretaceous age rocks. And but I stuck to it. It's not where you start; it's where you end up. And now I lead expeditions to the North Pole and the South Pole, and all points in between, all 7 continents. But I began with a passion, with the idea of finding the evidence. There was something beautiful in that. In that predicting where to look, and then finding it, and seeing that fossil for the first time. So I had to learn a whole lot of new things and get better at it real quick. But that's what life's about, right?
Yeah, for sure. So let's dig into evolution for a second. I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about you is the way you mentioned this at the beginning, kind of the human side of it and the people behind it. It's amazing that in 2020, most people still associate evolution and evolutionary science with one person still, right?
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is.
And one of the things you do is you kind of highlight the Mount Rushmore, to use a term that's been in vogue lately, of people that should be recognized, and maybe more people that we should know, people that should be in our popular consciousness. Can you kind of talk through maybe the 4 or 5 people, or even whoever, that you think are the kind of people that connect Darwin to the current moment that we're in?
Well, there are a lot of them. I mean, I think the thing about Darwin was, he was just a beautiful observer of nature. He was a great synthesist, that he would see different observations, whether it's coral reefs or bird species on an island, and he'd put or embryos, and he'd put it all together in a theory that was predictive. He didn't have many fossils at the time, but he made predictions about the fossil record based on his theory. The one thing Darwin didn't know, well, there are a lot of things he didn't know, and some things he was wrong about. He didn't know anything about genes. They didn't know anything about genetics or heredity, let alone DNA. That was a century later, right? And so, the whole science of genetics and molecular biology and DNA is a science that was years from being born when Darwin did his work. So some of so the Mount Rushmore of people who I like to tell the story of were people who sort of began to see Linus Pauling and Emil Zuckerkandl, 2 people who worked at Caltech in the 1950s, early 60s. They saw that you could study, and they were beginnings in the early days of DNA and understanding protein structures. What they saw is that if you studied proteins of living creatures and compared, say, a protein like hemoglobin, right, in blood, of different species, with people, frogs, cows, fish, that you can begin to decipher their evolutionary history. That is, you can use the molecules inside living creatures as a kind of library to tell the history. That was just so powerful, because before, understanding evolutionary history was really just all about collecting fossils, which was great, comparing anatomy. But now we have, this huge repository. And it was really Linus Pauling. When you think of Linus Pauling, you think of a lot of things. Vitamin C, what he was a big proponent of in terms of human health. He had a huge anti-nuclear stance. He was also in a race against Watson and Crick to discover the double helix DNA. So he was one of these more really remarkable people. Another one who's really remarkable is a woman by the name of Barbara McClintock. And she was working at Cold Spring Harbor in New York in mid 1900s. And she had gone to Cornell, and here's a person who had overcome adversity. She went to Cornell to study genetics, but I think she was there in like the 1920s, and she was not allowed to study genetics as a woman. It was not a woman's field, so she had to go into horticulture. And so from horticulture, she decided, well, no, I want to study corn. So she started to study corn, and she uncovered the fact that she knew the fact actually that an ear of corn contains kernels, right? And those kernels have, each represents a different individual. So a ear of corn contains, hundreds of different individual embryos. Well, anyway, she bred corn, and she had found a new kind of gene, a jumping gene, a gene that can make a copy of itself and jump across the genome. I can't tell you how important that is, because these jumping genes have taken over genomes and been a fuel for evolution. And so much so that 2/3 of our own genome is made of these jumping genes. Anyway, she's a powerful figure and one who was overlooked for many years. She ended up, after she published a paper on this, people kind of didn't know what to make of it or ignored it. She ended up winning the Nobel Prize, years later. Julia Barlow Platt, another woman. A lot of individuals were overlooked, or were women, by the way. Julia Barlow Platt was another woman who made a huge breakthrough, but at her time was not recognized for who she was. People who studied embryos, and saw that studying embryos could tell us how embryos develop from egg to adult. So that could tell us a lot about evolutionary history. So it's a big Mount Rushmore of hundreds of characters. Many of them have been overlooked for a long period of time, and it was a great joy for me to tell some of their personal stories of the things they had to overcome to make those discoveries.
What do you think, in our current space? I don't know. It doesn't seem as if, we have so many arguments about science, especially right now in this current moment. The climate science arguments, people are still having these silly arguments. But it doesn't seem like we're discussing evolution or denying it maybe as much as we were even 20 years ago. Is that just not seeing it, or is there an actual?
There are polls that have shown that too. Yeah, that denial of evolution has gone way down. There's a lot of reasons for that. Number one is the genome projects. With each new genome project, we see in DNA, we see evolution ever more clearly. The other piece is, evolution has an applied side. That is, we can understand the virus SARS-CoV-2 that causes, COVID-19, for instance. We use evolutionary techniques to map it and to understand it. So you can apply evolutionary techniques in a way that's very important that we couldn't do years ago. I mean, there's still plenty of, of science denial, including evolution denial, but it's a lot less than it used to be. But it's still real. I mean, I think, sometimes people are very, put off by science. It can be very challenging to them in many ways, because it confronts some maybe beliefs that they have and so forth. So, but I think we're seeing a little bit less of that, at least on the evolution side, than we did in the past. But it's still real. I mean, it's still there in some parts of the world.
I'm curious to know, when I was a kid and I was learning about evolution for the first time, the questions always become, how come you don't see it in real time? Meaning you don't see those in-between moments, those transitions, right? And I can't remember there was someone who said, what good is half of a wing or whatever, those kind of, seeing those in between, I guess that's the missing link, those kind of in between pieces. But you're kind of saying, those are there to be seen.
Very much so.
So I guess the question becomes, how do we understand that those things exist more, and how do we show those connective pieces more?
Well, let me give you an example from my own work. I mean, you can compare a fish to a limbed animal, right, or to a land-living animal, and you can look at all the differences between a fish that lives in water and creatures that walk on land, right? One has fins, the other has limbs, all kinds of differences. Well, we can make predictions about where and when to look in the fossil record to find intermediates. So my colleagues and I, I work as part of a team. I didn't do it alone, of course. But, we predicted that, if we looked at rocks of a certain age, of a certain type, in a certain place, that we'd find a fish with arms and legs, with lungs and gills, with a neck, and we were able to find it. So you can make definite, and people have done that left and right. We're not the first people to do that kind of thing. People have found, feathered dinosaurs that have feathers and wings and so forth. And the key point is that we can make those predictions and then find the creatures that bridge those gaps. That's huge. That's really important. But the other big piece is kind of nothing ever begins when you think it does. And here's it's a big point of the book. It's really amazing. That is, if you think that lungs arose when creatures evolved to walk on land, or that feathers arose as animals evolved to fly, you'd be in really good company. you'd also be entirely wrong. And we've known it for over a century. Lungs first arose in fish eons before creatures took their first steps on land. Arms and legs first arose in fish before animals took their first steps on land. They arose in fish living in aquatic ecosystems. And what happened is all the great inventions for these huge evolutionary transitions were already there. It was just basically they were repurposed, or they gained new importance as the opportunity arose to use them. Lungs originally arose in fish living in water, because fish would have lungs and gills, and they'd use both. When the oxygen content of the water was high, they'd use the gills. When it dropped, they'd use the lungs. And we see lungs in lots of fish today, where they're identical to our own lungs, and they're primitive fish. And so that's the story of evolution. So when you see these intermediates, we see them everywhere. Once you know how to look, you see it everywhere, and you see it in the genome as well, which is pretty remarkable too. So that's why it's like a detective story. Multiple lines of evidence. We look for multiple lines of evidence to point to the same conclusion, and that's what's exciting about today. We have all these different kinds of evidence to use as biologists.
Yeah, I love that reference you made earlier when you were saying nothing ever begins when we think it does.
Yes.
I think that's a quote from someone, I can't remember who from.
Lillian Hellman. I was like, it was the funniest story. I was finishing the book, right? And I had this in my head that like kind of nothing ever begins when I think it does. And I was reading her autobiography. She had a hard living life. I mean, she really did. She was blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthy, and she couldn't work for a long period of time. And she did her autobiography, looking back on this, boozy history and just amazing life. Yeah, she had a quote. It says, "Nothing, of course, ever begins when you think it does." And I said, there's the quote that I'm going to hang in the front end of the book, because that's kind of what we're talking about.
Might be the first time Lillian Hellman's been quoted in science.
In a biology book. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's fascinating. I love what you were talking about. You talk about wrong turns and how important these things are in evolutionary science, or science more broadly, just the discovery of anything, really. And I think that you were talking about, Darwin, of course, had no idea about genetics or anything like that. And of course, he made mistakes because he didn't have access to the tools or to the technology or to the knowledge of that. But he was right. You kind of talk about the fact that he was right at the time, which is an interesting concept, because you think about things as like, you're either right or you're wrong. But he was right at the moment with the tools that he had. And if he hadn't done that, we wouldn't have maybe gotten to this thing. Can you talk about your kind of theory of why wrong turns are important?
Wrong turns are hugely important. I mean, think about it like this. We're all fumbling around in a dark room, right? And you're going to take some, that's what it's about. You're going to make some mistakes, and it's all about learning from your failures. But Darwin also, he had a theory that was so powerful that it applied to DNA, even though nobody knew what DNA existed. He actually made predictions that were borne out by studies of DNA, 120 years later, which is really remarkable. But in science, science as a process is something that involves a lot of trial and error. I mean, as I tell my graduate students and postdocs, nothing ever works the first time. I tell them never do anything for the first time. It's the biggest joke, right? But because honestly, no experiment works the first time, no field expedition works the first time. You have to, it's trial and error, learn from your failures, and they're not failures if you learn from them. And like for instance, finding that fish with arms up in the Canadian Arctic, that took us 6 years. We didn't find it the first time. We didn't find it the second time. We didn't find it the third time.
6 years of purposely looking for that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Going there, going to the wrong place, and not there. Try this one, that kind of thing. And yeah, it took us a while to do that. We always believed in ourselves, and sometimes actually we started not to after a period of time. After year 5, you're not really believing in yourself too usually. But that's an important part of science. It's not the it's the troubleshooting, it's the learning from your failures. And we see that in the history of science quite a bit. There are a lot of dead ends that are taken, but they're not really dead ends because the scientists learn from them and then adjusted accordingly. Or that the time changed, and what was a dead end in the 1800s turns out to be a fruitful area of research in the in the 2000s, that kind of thing.
I mean, you've been at this for a while now. How much different is it now even than when you started? Meaning the impact of new knowledge, technology, all these different things.
Yeah, it's huge. So, I went to graduate school to study paleontology, to be a fossil hunter, right? And I do that now, I still do. But I realized that I had to be learn molecular biology and other disciplines. And so what you'll find is if you look in the field now, people are multidisciplinary. They're using multiple different tools from different areas of science, whether it's geology or biology or genetics or ecology. They're using multiple tools at once. So, I mean, science now, as compared to when I started, is much more multidisciplinary. People are delving into different fields, or they're building collaborations among people in different fields. And that was something, I went to graduate school in the early 80s. That was something that was, you trained as a paleontologist, right? That's it. But you didn't do these other things. But that's I think that's one of the big things that's changed in the last 40 years, is that
Are there any
40 years.
downsides to that? Are there,
Well, yeah, I mean, there's huge downsides to it. So, like, one of the things is I always feel dumb. Yeah, I always feel behind the eight ball. If I'm entering a new field, I realize, oh, I got to learn, this branch of genetics. I got to start over again, right? I'm the student all of a sudden, and I fumble around a bit. So you always have to retool a bit, but you're always learning. But sometimes you're always naive, which is good. You're bringing your own viewpoint to it.
I mean, there are benefits to dilettantism sometimes, in terms
There
of,
is.
I think it's, and I guess, do you think that the root of that is just the people that are in your field? There's just a natural curiosity that can't really be quenched sometimes with just one pursuit.
Well, that's what I mean. I think that's what makes it so fun to be with these people. They're very curious. I mean, I think the scientists who I respect the most have an insatiable curiosity, and my mentors and the people who really fueled my passion for science, they just had an insatiable curiosity about understanding the world, and we're kind of fearless about trying to explore things in new ways. And I always, modeled myself on that, whether, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But that's so powerful. And that's one of the things that fuels science, is just a fundamental curiosity about nature. Darwin when he was a kid, used to collect, rocks and bugs and things like that. And, that curiosity was evinced in him at an early age, and I think the scientists I know and have had the most impact on me have that kind of just passion for understanding the world.
Like almost like a capacity to retain a certain amount of wonder,
Oh yeah, and that is important when you are writing a book. When you're trying to communicate to the general public. Every now and then you sort of pinch yourself and say, "Wow," and you want to capture that moment. Like here's an example. So my colleagues and I were cracking rocks in a place in the middle of the Arctic, and we're pulling out fossil fish, in Ellesmere Island, right? So it's about 80 north latitude. It's cold in the summer. And we're pulling these, we have a quarry, we're pulling these fossils out. We have fish, big fish, little fish, plants, invertebrates. And we're pulling out of the rocks evidence of a tropical world. These are tropical creatures. These are tropical plants. These are warm and active creatures. Yet here we are in the middle of the Arctic. And the juxtaposition between present and past is just so great. And there's a moment where you just, you just have to step back and say, wow. We have this sort of time machine looking in the rocks and seeing this distant past. And this past is so different from what's there in the present. I mean, there are polar bears or muskox in the distance, and here we have this tropical world of fish with arms in the rocks. So every now and then you just got to say, wow. And you want to capture that wonder, So as a working scientist, sometimes you lose that, right? Because you're in the nitty gritty. But I like to be able to step back from time to time and kind of retain that wonder, because it's really important for students.
You found a polar bear fossil in Phoenix or something like that. It'd be very
yeah, that's right. No, exactly. Finding it in Tulsa. Yeah, exactly.
We have a question from one of our viewers on Facebook, and the question is, what is something that we might see now as a sign of how humans as a species are continuing to evolve? Is there any kind of
great question? Yeah, we can see that too. So when you we can now sequence human genomes pretty rapidly. And so we can compare the genome of different people from around the planet. And one thing we're seeing, and when you look at the genome and you compare the genome of different people in different populations, what you see is that we are evolving still. You wouldn't know it, but we are. And we're evolving in some pretty important ways. Some ways that we're evolving is in our relationship to microbes. We have microbes inside of us, we have microbes on us, some of those microbes, and our balance with microbes is fundamental to our health, right? I mean, witness where we are today with a virus, right? And when that gets out of balance, then we suffer consequences. It turns out there's a number of ways we're evolving in our balance with microbes, bacteria and viruses. But the other kinds of adaptations that we're seeing in the human genome, and we can see it in our genomes, is our physiological adaptations, resistance to diseases, to drugs, dietary changes, and so forth, susceptibility to disease and things like that. So those are the kinds of traits we're seeing evolving right now. And there's evidence for actually natural selection in the human genome over the past several centuries, which is pretty remarkable. And that's only possible because of the new technology that we have. Now, that doesn't give us a huge window into the future, right? So I can't tell you what we're going to look like in a million years, right? But I can tell you one thing that's going to be important for us is technology, because it's not just our genes that are impacting, the human body. It's the technologies we have, right? The eyeglasses, medicines, cultural practices, educational practices. These things affect the quality of our lives and our capabilities as much as our genes, right? It's our ideas and the ways we do that. So when you think about answering that question, yes, we can see the signature of natural selection in our genome, but you also, when you think about human change over time, our evolution, if you will, it's going to be as much about our technology and access to those technologies that's going to be important as well, if you think about the distant future.
You've mentioned COVID-19 a couple of times. We can't go an hour in our lives without talking about it. So, but you do talk about the value in a positive way that viruses have impacted evolution. I think we all think of viruses as an inherently negative thing, but they have made some pretty important contributions to evolution. Can you talk about that a little bit?
They have, yeah. So it's pretty surprising stuff. We have a very complicated relationship with viruses. When you think about viruses, what they are molecular machines. That's what they are. They're molecular machines that are made to enter a host and to commandeer that host to make more copies of themselves. That's what they do. Now, if you look at our genome, the human genome, only 2% of our genome, only 2% of it are our own genes, are the second section portions that code for proteins. 8% of our genome, 8, is our ancient viral elements, viral genetic material that just somehow was there from invasions in the distant past that got knocked out. So we have 4 times more viral genetic material in our own genomes than our own genes. That's really surprising. But the importance of the story is really fun. It's actually a great story. It goes to a discovery made by Jason Shepard at the University of Utah just a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So Jason's a neurobiologist, not doesn't study viruses. He doesn't study evolution. He studies memory. He studies neurobiology. He's interested in memory. He's interested in the genes that play a role in memories. And he was interested in one gene called ARC, A-R-C. It's a gene and it makes a protein. And it's important. It's present in a lot of different animals. So for instance, mice that have ARC, if they have a mutation in ARC, they can solve a maze, but they can't remember their solution the next day. So it's clearly involved in memories. Likewise, humans, if humans have a mutation in ARC, they can have all kinds of cognitive deficits. So we study ARC, and he pops the protein that ARC makes under a microscope. It took him a while to do this. Popped it under the microscope, looks under the microscope, and he says, I've seen that before. He digs out his microbiology textbook, and it turns out it was the proteins that ARC made were identical to the protein made by HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. He's like, what? And so he calls his colleagues in the medical school at the University of Utah, calls his colleagues in the building next door, and he invites them over to the lab to look at the slide, but he doesn't tell them what's on the slide. And they look into the slide, they just, oh, that's HIV. He's like, nope, it's ARC, a memory gene. Like, what? And so it turns out the more they look, the more they find that ARC is a repurposed virus. So, and then when they looked at a variety of species, it turns out that the best hypothesis is that sometime in the distant past, a virus invaded a distant ancestor of ours. And that virus was then, over time, repurposed, not for infection, but to make a protein that serves in memory. So here's a case where a virus was put to a new use. And it turns out that's not alone. Proteins that are in the placenta during pregnancy, they were related to ancient viral invasions as well. And it turns out this is fairly common. The more we look, the more we find. really amazing. So it's not just that like the viruses, cause all this harm, which they do, but sometimes they're put to new use. Sometimes they can be fuel for evolutionary change.
Just to kind of stretch that out a little bit further, because I've piqued my interest about that. When you think about something like ARC and the memory concept and the virus and how viruses can be used, and also how we think about immunizations and how viruses are used for vaccines in a milder form, is something like that eventually going to be how we get to an Alzheimer's cure? Is that something that's going to be connected to like some kind of gene therapy where you can deal with those kind of things, or is that
Yeah,
totally-
Alzheimer's complex. There's a couple different ways and things that changes that cause that. There are different bodies that form and the plaques that form in the brain. So we have to figure out how those plaques are forming, what causes those plaques. So now there are a lot of, look, I can't answer that directly, but one thing I can say is that the molecular tools that we have today are so rapidly developing and advancing and so powerful that I think I'm very optimistic about our future for being able to, conquer many of the diseases that ail us, including, COVID-19.
Yeah.
When you think about, just to do a COVID-19 riff for a second, the science that is happening, in today, in days to weeks, a science that like 10 years ago would have been happening in decades or years. You know what I mean? So the kinds of advances that we can make now with the kinds of molecular tools that we have is the sort of stuff that just is going so blazingly fast. Just to be able to talk about the possibility of having a vaccine in 2021, people would have laughed at you 10 years ago. But now we have these tools with mRNA and proteins and nanoparticles and so forth that lend a degree of optimism.
When you were a kid and you watched science fiction films, or you would read speculative fiction books or whatever you were into as a kid, and you would see, flying cars and all these things that were like, this is what the future will look like. Obviously, we don't have necessarily that Blade Runner kind of world we're in right now, but do you think that people don't understand that in many ways we're more progressed technologically and maybe less subtle and more subtle ways than even those kind of fantasy ideas of what the early 21st century might look like could be, because it's all kind of smaller scientific breakthroughs?
Yeah, well, think about it this way. Think about the Jetsons. Do you remember the Jetsons? Maybe I'm dating myself. Maybe aging myself. The Jetsons, right? They were like with the Flintstones. The Flintstones were in the past. The Jetsons were a family that lived in the future. Right? And they had the flying cars, and they had this thing, where George Jetson would talk to his boss, and it'd be like a TV, and George Jetson would talk to his boss on this TV. And it was like video conferencing. This is like from a cartoon in the mid 60s. When you think about that vision of the future, obviously we're doing it right now with our computers, but we're doing it with a small little device that you can put in your pocket. When you think about an iPhone, it's the future or iPhone, an Android phone, whatever. It's there's so much technology in there, and that we're so attached to them that some of the devices that we see today that we take for granted weren't even on the radar screen of science fiction writers, or back 50 years ago.
It shows you the kind of the limitations of imagination, because you watch something even like, I don't know, say you watch Back to the Future Part 2 or something like that. They have all these crazy things, but people are still reading physical newspapers, right? So like there's this that people couldn't quite see beyond what the things are in your life. Anyway, that's a little bit of a riff there, but just interesting that the things that we think we measure progress on maybe are not the things that actually, signify progress technologically or scientifically.
Well, in my world, one of the challenges I have as a scientist is the pace of technological change is so incredibly fast that I could start an experiment one year, and by a year into it, the technology will have, dated the experiment that I'm doing. That new technology comes out, so rapidly, particularly in genome science, imaging, computational science, all those things going blazingly fast to the point where, you almost can't keep up with the new techniques that are coming out almost week to week. You just take things like gene editing, right? The ability to edit DNA, which people may have heard of, like CRISPR-Cas genome editing, which is this ability to cut and paste DNA to rewrite the genetic code. You couldn't have imagined that 20 years ago. But now pretty much every scientist in genetics is doing it in some way or shape or form. And that's from, and that started in 2012, 2013, when the first like real serious papers showing the technology. And every couple months, there's a new paper on this that changes the way we think about it. It's kind of amazing.
Is that exciting or frustrating or both? It's like,
All the above. Yeah, it's exciting. It is frustrating because it's hard to keep up sometimes. But it's no, it's thrilling actually to think about the genetic power, that we have to understand basic biology, and that's already having, going to have an impact in human health and agriculture, in so many things in our lives.
you teach, so many young people, and you spend a lot of time around young people and young scientists getting into the field who were in the place you were at that time. I wonder, when you think about science generally, if it's more similar, if you think about the way we think of art and sports, in the sense of, does the aptitude change with time? Meaning, like, when you were in your 20s and 30s, and the kind of way you thought about things, is it different as you get older? Meaning, like, do you think the capacity for abstract thought changes as you get more kind of set in certain ways and you do things? Is there a benefit to youth, the way like art or sports or any of the other things kind of
Oh
play
yeah,
into
definitely.
yeah.
Definitely. I mean, they're definitely much more creative and experimental in some ways, as on average, I think. When I talk about these new technologies, it's usually the students and the younger postdocs who come in and say, hey, we should try this technique. And I'm like, oh yeah, where'd you try that? They're on the, they're much more often on the cutting edge.
Right.
And I like it when they have a fearlessness to it as well, to try new things. I've been really lucky to have great graduate students and postdocs who were able to do that. And by the way, they're the ones who have led me in new directions. Oftentimes they'll come into the lab and say, hey, I've tried this experiment, check it out. I'm like, oh, wow, we should do more of that. It's like that kind of thing. Good job, great job. But that's what's invigorating about being in the field of being a teacher, right? You're interacting with young people
Yeah.
all the time.
Do you, thinking about the world we're living in the past month or so, and the fields that you're in, what kind of diversity is in those fields, and is there an effort to change that landscape? I would imagine, like many things, it's probably fairly majority white.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Is
definitely.
there a gender split also, fairly one way or the
Yeah,
other?
and it's more male. I mean, so basically, so if you look at the science as a whole, in my age class, the 60 somethings, it's definitely white and male. I mean, very predominant. We lose many of our women scientists by that age. It's interesting though, if you look at graduate school, particularly in biology, not for physics and math, but in biology, and particularly certain kinds of biology, like developmental biology, we tend to have more female students than male initially, but we lose them along the path. And we've taken a lot of steps to try, as a field, to try to stop that loss, that attrition that we have. We tend to lose them early in the academic career. But yeah, diversity is a real challenge for us. Oftentimes, we've been, well before the current state, we've been trying to address that. And it's become increasingly an urgent issue, and it actually has practical challenges for us, because the kinds of questions people look at are actually based on their backgrounds. People with different backgrounds have a way of asking different kinds of questions. That's it. And I think the richer people have shown that the more diverse a committee is, the more it can come to a correct decision. So the more diverse a discipline, the more kind of diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds and so forth, the richer it is. And so we've really tried to address that, but we haven't done as well as we could or should.
Do you think that boils down to mostly a socioeconomic problem, meaning that access to good science from even like a primary school level is different based on where you live and how much money you have,
A
access?
lot of it. It's a lot of it. It's access. It's role models. It's people not even knowing. So when my book came out March 13th, right, which was like the worst day since Pearl Harbor to release a book. So my book tour was canceled, and so what I decided is, instead of doing a book tour, which I can't do because it was canceled, to drop in on high schools. I offered on Twitter to drop in on high schools, and I dropped into over 100 of them. And I would talk to students of different stripes around the country about evolution, paleontology, science, and almost invariably they would want to talk about careers in science. How do you do science? Can people actually have a career in science? A lot of them not only don't have the access, but they also don't see science as a potential career. Or they lack the role models. They lack the knowledge of, wow, I can actually go and study paleontology in a school, that kind of thing. And so and socioeconomic. It's just loaded with so many different challenges to enhancing the diversity of our scientific workforce. That it can seem daunting, but we're making some progress. It's not as much as we could or should, but we are making some. But I think we're poised to make more. I'm really optimistic.
Yeah.
I tend to be an optimist about humans, despite sometimes events. But my own field crews have been. My lab is very diverse. We've involved the Inuit community up in the Canadian Arctic, which has been just so enriching for all of us. And we named the fossil with a naming committee from the Inuit elders. We had youth from local Inuit village join our expedition, and it's just been so. Everybody who's profited by such a thing.
I'd like to end. You mentioned, you're an optimist by nature. I'd like to end on a couple of things about that. Do you think going through the pandemic that we're in right now, having your training and your background, does that set you up to be more optimistic about where we are? And one, are you optimistic? And two, how do you maintain that even when we see these ups and downs?
Well, it's optimistic about what? So I'm about science and scientific breakthroughs associated with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. We've learned something. The sequence of the virus was published like January 7th or something like that. And since that time, we have almost 200 vaccine candidates. 200. That's enormous. And
Can you explain that in terms of I don't know what that means historically. How is that crazy compared to past?
Yes. It's off the charts. Okay. It would not happen in 15 years for other diseases. Wow. This has happened in 7 months. And so, it's off the charts. And, a number of these, I think 10 to 15 are in human trials right now in different stages, and some of them are showing a degree of promise. Other therapies are coming online, things called monoclonal antibodies, they're coming online. So, the technologies of science and the passion of scientists and the focus of science does lend me a degree of optimism about, being able to handle the virus. However, it's the communication of science to how many people are going to want a vaccine, how many people are going to, do social distancing and masking for the period of time. There are techniques practices we know that work, and there's the social piece that's very challenging, and I don't understand it as well. So I'm optimistic about the science, about the social side, about people doing the right practices to control the virus. That's something it's out of scientists' control. That's much more social. That's for the social scientists, the politicians.
What's something that you think in the next 5, 10, 20 years that will be one or two revolutions that are kind of around the corner? Do you think there are a couple of things, whether that's in health, whether that's in understanding of ourselves, it could be just more informational, things that might really be paradigm shifts for us as a species? That's a big question.
Right. But I think, if you think about, what's inside our skulls, the brain, here's several pounds of tissue, several, couple trillion cells that can see the universe, that can look back to the Big Bang and see the future, that can, it's just, the brain is remarkable. And if you think about technologies applied to understanding the brain, I think that's where we're going to really have so much to understand, consciousness, memory, behavior from a biological level, and to be able to treat in ways we couldn't before. So I think, if you think about some of the great breakthroughs, it'll be really understanding our brain, because that's the center of the universe for us, right? And so, and I think that's where so many breakthroughs, and brain evolution, by the way, we're learning a lot about that too.
Yeah. If you guys have enjoyed what we've talked about tonight, we barely scratched the surface, and you need to read Some Assembly Required. You're going to just have a great time. You're going to learn a lot. And I think like most great books, it's going to send you on an internet journey every night, trying to learn more about every little thing that you see and read in the book, which is always fun to me when I close a book and I want to just know more about everything that I just read about. So I want to say a big thank you to Neal for the time. Go out and get the book. We've got links here in our chat. You can get that directly from us. And thank you for your time and your knowledge and sharing it with us. And we really appreciate it and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. You too. Stay healthy, stay happy.
Everybody. See you. Bye.
Bye.